I've said it before and I'll say it again. Democracy simply doesn't work.
Those were the immortal words of Kent Brockman, the grumpy and fictional local Springfield news anchor on The Simpsons, but if he was even remotely honest, they could just as easily be the words of FIFA president Gianni Infantino. You might have noticed that freedom doesn't rank too high at FIFA's list of priorities when it comes to selecting World Cup host nations. The last two finals have been held in Russia and Qatar, a repressive kleptocracy which has been ruled by a much less charming Dobby the House Elf since 1999, and a tiny oil and particularly gas-rich Gulf state where the hereditary emir holds all executive, legislative, and judicial control. What a fella. In short then, two authoritarian dictatorships, and that is just the way that FIFA likes it. The likes of Morocco, North Korea, China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia have all been tipped to host future tournaments either on their own or as co-hosts, and this is by no means a recent phenomenon. Europe's first World Cup was held in fascist Italy in 1934, where Italian dictator Benito Mussolini exerted significant influence, shall we just say, and when Argentina won their first World Cup on home soil in 1978, under Jorge Videa's unelected right-wing military junta, there were political prisoners detained in concentration camps who could hear the cheers from less than a mile away. It might sound conspiratorial to suggest that FIFA actually prefers dictatorships to democracies, but I'm afraid that it is just a matter of fact. Don't take my word for it though, I'm just some loser on YouTube. Back in 2013, FIFA's Secretary General Jerome Valk stated, quote, "I will say something which is crazy, but less democracy is sometimes better for organising a World Cup. When you have a very strong head of state who can decide, as maybe Putin can do in 2018, that is easier for us organisers than a country such as Germany, where you have to negotiate at different levels." End quote. Valk is long gone now. He was fired in 2016 as a result of allegations arising from FIFA's 2015 corruption scandal, but the sentiment that he expressed still remains. In 2021, current FIFA president Gianni Infantino stated, quote, "Human rights are now a requirement in our bidding process, but we must also realise that human rights being a requirement means also addressing it, going to the people, and not excluding anyone, but including everyone in the world." End quote. Basically, it was Infantino responding to being asked a direct question about whether FIFA would take human rights abuses into consideration ahead of future World Cup host selections, and responding, well, with this meme. It's a bit like an airline stating that knowing how to land a plane is a requirement for becoming a pilot, but that in the interest of not excluding anyone, they would also welcome people who just so happen to think that landing a plane nose first into the runway at full speed, you know, it might be a good idea. Don't knock it until you try it. Today, I feel like a scorch mark on the tarmac. But why exactly does Infantino, why did his predecessor Sepp Blatter, and why do FIFA as a whole love dictatorships quite so much? It would be easy to make the case that it is because they are intrinsically evil. I mean, they don't exactly help themselves, do they? And that they just have an insatiable lust for brutality and cozying up to tyrants, but I don't actually think that is the case. Rather, FIFA and Infantino are just unmoved by such trivial matters as freedom, democracy, or human rights abuses. They would have as much fondness for the benevolent dictator, if such a thing were possible, as they do for Mohammed bin Salman and his band of bonesaw-wielding thugs who go around butchering journalists that the dear leader doesn't like. It is the concentration of power and the lack of accountability and oversight that appeals to FIFA so much, not the morals of the dictatorships that they are dealing with in of themselves. It is strictly business. Of course, Russia and Qatar bought the rights to host the 2018 and 2022 World Cups using a raft of illicit payment and bribery schemes, since exposed in FIFA's myriad corruption scandals, but it was the legitimate, or at least legal revenue streams that were often even more appealing and important to FIFA. When Velk stated that less democracy is sometimes better for organising a World Cup, he was drawing a direct contrast between the 2014 World Cup in Brazil and the 2018 World Cup in Russia. The Frenchman, who spent more than a decade as one of the most senior figures at FIFA, went on to state, quote, "The main fight we have when we enter a country where the political structure is divided, as it is in Brazil, into three levels: the federal state, the state level, and the city level. There are different people, different movements, different interests, and it is quite difficult to organise a World Cup in such conditions." End quote. Brazil has a very similar political structure to the United States. It is a federal presidential constitutional republic where power is divided between the executive, the president, the legislature, Congress, and the judiciary, the Supreme Court. Also, as in the United States, as Velk mentioned, Brazil's 26 states have considerable devolved powers and autonomy over wide-ranging issues, and major cities have their own mayors, budgets, and political priorities. There is a certain amount of bureaucracy which comes with having multiple political structures. Bureaucracy isn't always a bad thing, though the word itself is almost always used as a pejorative, but as far as FIFA is concerned, it adds admin, slows things down, and, most importantly of all, can damage their bottom line. Dictatorships, meanwhile, well, they can act fast, they're not answerable to anyone, and they are able to make unilateral decisions on the spot. Qatari NIMBYs can hardly tell the Emir that they think building an 8th mega stadium within a 30-mile radius in a country with fewer than half as many citizens as Luxembourg for a 4-week-long tournament that will have no use once the World Cup ends is a bad idea, or might not be the best allocation of state resources, and he would have no need to listen to them even if they could. Nor could a concerned Russian citizen object to the construction of a 44,442-seater stadium in the city of Saransk, which just 5 years after the World Cup in 2018 has had 3 different occupants, all of whom have since ceased to exist, leaving the Mordovia Arena as a big fat white elephant in the heart of the Republic of Mordovia, empty and without an occupant of any description. That is not to say that dictatorships always mismanage or make a pig's ear of hosting World Cups, whilst democracies are infallible. Quite the opposite, in fact, in FIFA's eyes at least. Many South Africans were evicted from their own homes to make way for the construction or renovation of South Africa's 10 World Cup stadiums in 2010, only one of which was still in the black just 4 years later. The Nelson Mandela Bay Stadium in Eastern Cape, which takes the name of the nation's most famous son and cost a whopping $270 million to renovate, is a withering husk of a venue just 13 years on from the World Cup. Its occupants, Chippa United, average around 7,000 fans at their home games, which means that the stadium is often only 10% full. Bafana, South Africa's national team, have failed to qualify for any of the 3 World Cups since hosting the tournament, leading some to conclude that the tournament's legacy has been one of failure, and that the money would have been much better off invested elsewhere. That was the view of an enormous number of Brazilians as well, before the country had even hosted the World Cup for a second time in 2014. Many Brazilians felt that the nation's $11.7 billion budget earmarked for the World Cup, which later swelled to $15 billion, would be better spent on schools, hospitals, and on public transport. In the month leading up to the tournament, over 1 million Brazilians took to the street to voice their opposition to Brazil's World Cup expenditure, and they continued to take forms of direct action after the tournament had begun. The Estadio Nacional Mané Garrincha, meanwhile, another World Cup stadium sporting the name of a national icon, is perhaps the white elephant to end all white elephants. Built at an eye-watering cost of almost $700 million, making it by far the most expensive stadium in South America, and the second most expensive football stadium in the world when it opened, within just 3 years of the World Cup, it was already falling into a state of disrepair, and its car park being used as a bus depot. Whoever could have foreseen that Brasilia, Brazil's federal capital, which was founded in 1960, has no major football clubs, little football culture, and where almost everyone supports one of Brazil's Big 12, would have had trouble filling a 72,788-seater super stadium fit for Bayern Munich or Real Madrid. It is a real head-scratcher. None of the stadium's occupants even compete in Brazil's nationwide league pyramid, let alone the top flight, and it is rare for the Estadio Nacional to be more than 5% full. So democracies are by no means infallible, but incidentally, the very fact that Brazilians have a legal right to take to the streets and protest, albeit they are sometimes met with relatively brutal police force, is another big fat negative as far as FIFA is concerned when compared to authoritarian regimes like Russia and Qatar. Millions of Brazilians protesting Brazil hosting the World Cup under a campaign that was literally nicknamed FIFA Go Home, with graffiti like this adorning the streets of Sao Paulo, wasn't exactly ideal press as far as FIFA was concerned around their showpiece event. Forced into comment when there were similar protests during the Confederations Cup, Sepp Blatter stated, quote, "I can understand that people are not happy, but they should not use football to make their demands heard." End quote. His cause wasn't exactly helped by some Brazilian internationals, such as Hulk, voicing their agreement with the protesters. All in all, the whole thing was terribly inconvenient for FIFA, and all just a little embarrassing. The solution, of course, is simply to host the World Cup in a country where protest is illegal. Problem solved. Perhaps that is why Suella Braverman is pushing so hard to criminalise protest here in the United Kingdom. She managed to fool some of us into thinking that she was just a poisonous, over-promoted, crypto-fascist culture war clown, but all she really wants is to bring football back home and host a World Cup when the Tories inevitably return to power in 2029 or 2034. I owe you an apology, Suella. I wasn't really familiar with your game. One of the benefits of South Africa and Brazil, despite the challenges posed by them being democracies with some degree of accountability, is that they are both middle-income countries with relatively widespread corruption. I know that doesn't necessarily sound like a benefit, and if you are an ordinary South African or Brazilian citizen, then, well, it isn't, but from FIFA's perspective, it gives them a lot more leverage and influence. The next World Cup, though co-hosted by CONCACAF's three major associations, is primarily being hosted by the United States. The US has a very similar political system to Brazil, but it is also the richest and the most powerful country in the world, where corporations and billionaires often wield even more power than the state, if indeed you can disentangle the two at all. You could argue to what extent that erodes a country's right to be considered a democracy, but that really is another discussion and a whole other rabbit hole to go down in another video perhaps. The point in this instance is that FIFA cannot dictate to the United States in the same way that it can to South Africa and Brazil, let alone Russia and Qatar, and we are currently seeing how that plays out. Last week, The Athletic reported that Stan Kroenke, who owns the SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, is currently in dispute with FIFA over the financial arrangements ahead of the 2026 World Cup, and that Kroenke Sports and Entertainment have even threatened to walk away from hosting World Cup matches at the stadium at all. It is difficult to emphasise just how much of a blow that would be to FIFA and the World Cup's organising committee. Of course, the United States is not exactly lacking in large stadiums with outstanding facilities, but the SoFi Stadium is, by far, the most expensive stadium ever built anywhere in the world. Opened in 2020, the stadium ended up costing $5.5 billion to build. That is more than the total annual exports of 75 different countries. The next most expensive stadium ever built, the Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, which also opened in 2020, cost $1.9 billion, meaning that the SoFi Stadium cost almost 3 times as much as any other stadium in the world to build, and about 4 times as much as either the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium or Wembley Stadium. One of the reasons why the SoFi Stadium's build cost was so gargantuan is because of its enormous corporate offering, which is among the largest and probably the most luxurious of any stadium in the world. And that right there is music to FIFA's ears. Another reason why FIFA prefers developing nations, developing in a football sense that is, to established ones as World Cup hosts, is because more established football and sporting nations tend to have ready-made infrastructure required to host the World Cup. You might have thought that that was a good thing, and again, it is, just not from FIFA's perspective. FIFA has partners within the construction industry, and when stadiums are built or renovated by FIFA partners, FIFA gets more cash. In the case of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, 6 out of the 8 stadiums at the tournament were brand new. Meanwhile, the other 2 underwent such major renovations that they might as well have been as well. Not a single new stadium will be built, by contrast, in either Canada, Mexico, or the United States for the 2026 World Cup. And none in the United States are expected to even require significant renovations, though they may well be expanded if demand looks set to far outstrip supply. One of the ways in which FIFA can recoup lost revenue through the US not needing major infrastructure upgrades from which they can profit is through corporate and hospitality facilities, of which US stadiums boast a more impressive offering than stadia anywhere else in the world, and by some distance too. That is the reason why UEFA love hosting things in England and Germany so much, because there are lots of modern stadiums with a wealth of corporate hospitality seating, and plenty of companies and rich people willing to snap them up. The entire middle tier at Wembley Stadium, plus the Bobby Moore suite which covers 4 blocks of the lower bowl, can be dedicated to more than 15,000 corporate and hospitality tickets. That's why Wembley will hold a 3rd Champions League final in only 13 years this season, during which time no other stadium has hosted more than one, and why it was selected as the venue for the final of Euro 2020, which was spread out over multiple countries, and will most likely host the final of Euro 2028 as well. It is a major cash cow for UEFA, as are Germany's bountiful corporate offerings, which are priced at 40% more than hospitality tickets at the Euros just 2 years ago, at Euro 2024. The SoFi Stadium has almost as many hospitality seats as Wembley, over 13,000, plus a mammoth 260 private luxury suites, despite having 20,000 fewer seats overall, though there is talk of the capacity being expanded from 70,000 to 100,000 for the 2026 World Cup. Combine that with the stadium's location in Los Angeles, the 2nd highest GDP metropolitan area in the United States, and the city which played host to the final of both the 1994 World Cup and the 1999 Women's World Cup, and the SoFi Stadium is expected to be the most lucrative and one of the most important venues at the World Cup in 3 years' time, and as one of 3 stadiums reportedly shortlisted to host the final. Until the recent dispute, that is. Now the AT&T Stadium in Dallas is the favourite to host the final, and there are fears that Los Angeles, where FIFA chose to launch their 2026 World Cup branding, might not even have a World Cup venue. That seems to be almost inconceivable, given the city's size and past, and the Rose Bowl, which hosted the 1994 and 1999 finals, and has a current capacity of 92,542, making it over 30% larger than the SoFi Stadium, is still an operational ground. But as you can probably see from this picture, without me even needing to tell you, it can't quite compete when it comes to luxury suites and hospitality areas, which, much as they won't admit it, is what FIFA really cares about. The SoFi Stadium and Kroenke's dispute goes to the heart of why FIFA prefers dealing with dictatorships and, more pointedly, dictators themselves. When it came to 2018 World Cup venues, Infantino, Blatter and FIFA were essentially dealing with just one man. There were intermediaries and project managers, of course, but ultimately, it all came down to Vlad. At the 2022 World Cup, not only did FIFA only have to deal with Al-Thani and his lackeys, the finances of stadium arrangements were hardly even a consideration. Qatar spent a reported $220 billion hosting the 2022 World Cup, 7 times as much as Russia did in 2018, in what was already by far the most expensive World Cup up to that point. The trade-off for Qatar was not primarily a financial one, and the construction of 8 supremely expensive stadiums was not a business decision, or not directly at least. You wouldn't get a Stan Kroenke in Russia or Qatar, which I suppose you could argue is at least one positive of those regimes, because they'd have accidentally fallen out of a 12-story window or into an industrial meat grinder months ago. In the United States, by contrast, FIFA aren't doing the US any favours in terms of their prestige or reputation, or nothing that will move the dial at least. And FIFA aren't dealing exclusively with Joe Biden, or anyone else for that matter. In fact, one suspects that Biden has had, and will have, very little involvement in the entire tournament. That is it for today's video, a remarkably short one for me these days, but hopefully just as informative and entertaining as usual, so not very. I jest, of course. This is by far the best channel on the platform. Thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, make sure that you're subscribed. And have notifications turned on both for this channel, HITC Sevens, and my backup channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, or on Instagram, and now Threads, via the username @HITC Sevens, and all of the links that I just mentioned, and a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers.